Flames danced across my front lawn as 3 unmarked SUVs tore through my property line, and at the center of it all stood Karen from the HOA, barking orders like a battlefield general. One of the guys aimed a drone-mounted spotlight straight into my eyes, while another screamed at my goats to drop the weapon. That's when I realized they actually thought this was a tactical raid. Yep, that's me, crouched behind my rain barrel in nothing but boxer shorts and a flannel, watching my storm cellar get breached by what I can only describe as the worst neighborhood militia in history. You're probably wondering how I got here. Well, let's rewind. When I first moved out here, I wasn't looking for trouble, just a piece of quiet land with enough space between me and the nearest soul that I could let my boots dry on the porch without anyone asking questions. The property was a little beat up, sure, but it had bones, an old barn, a creek out back, and a stubborn patch of wildflower grass that hadn't seen a mower since Reagan was in office. I'd done my time in places where peace was an illusion and silence usually meant you were about to get ambushed, so when I found this corner of nowhere tucked outside the official lines of the Sunrise Valley HOA, I thought I'd finally found a place that didn't need defending. The realtor had even laughed when I asked if it was under any HOA control. "You're in the county, hon," she said, flipping her clipboard. "Ho can't touch you out here." That was about 11 months ago. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a glossy pamphlet taped to my mailbox, some cheery clip art of freshly trimmed hedges and pastel townhomes under the headline, Sunrise Valley Expansion. A vision for beautification. I gave it a glance, then tossed it in the burn barrel with the rest of the junk mail. Didn't think twice about it. But a week later, I got a formal-looking envelope stuck under my door with my name spelled wrong and a note about unapproved structures visible from the road. That structure? My rusted old tractor I'd parked near the fence line while I was rebuilding the gate. I called the number at the bottom, no answer, just a voicemail from someone named Karen Mitchell, acting president of the Sunrise Valley Homeowners Association. I didn't leave a message. I figured it was a clerical error. Maybe some overly eager volunteer with too much time and a clipboard full of bad ideas. Then came the grass complaint. My grass is technically a mix of crabgrass, moss, and what I assume is half a dozen endangered prairie species. I let it grow long for the goats, and because I liked it that way. But apparently it was disrupting visual continuity with the new homes being built a mile and a half up the hill. They hadn't even broken ground yet, but that didn't stop a laminated violation notice from showing up nailed to my front gate. It was professionally printed. The kind of thing you'd expect from a bank foreclosure, not a neighbor. This one came with a $150 fine for non-compliance. I laughed, crumpled it, and stuck it to the fridge as a joke. My dog Tank pissed on it later. I took that as a sign. Still, I wasn't looking to escalate. I figured they'd figure out their mistake eventually. But the letters kept coming. Noise violations, livestock warnings. One particularly rich accusation claimed I was operating a paramilitary training site due to frequent target practice and unusual traffic. That one made me pause. Sure, I shoot out back. It's a rural property, and my range is legal, permitted, and safely bermed. As for the traffic, I had 2 old Army buddies come visit one weekend. They parked their trucks by the barn, drank some beers, and helped me fix a busted fence. Not exactly a black ops operation. Still, something about the phrasing, paramilitary activity, didn't sit right. It was the kind of language meant to stir fear, to justify action. I dug out my property survey just to be sure, and confirmed what I already knew. I was outside the Sunrise Valley HOA boundary. Just barely, but outside nonetheless. That didn't stop them from escalating. I got a knock at the door one Thursday morning, about 3 weeks after the militia letter. It was a woman in a salmon blazer with a clipboard and a forced smile. "Hi, I'm Karen Mitchell. I'm with the Sunrise Valley HOA Beautification Committee. I didn't invite her in." She stood on my porch like she owned it, peering past me at my kitchen like she was taking inventory. "We've recently annexed adjacent parcels into our development zone," she said. "Including yours." I told her flatly that my parcel wasn't for sale, hadn't been rezoned, and was legally outside their reach. Her smile tightened. "For now," she said, with that same practiced cadence you hear from lawyers and real estate leeches. "We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page as we raise property values in the area." I didn't slam the door in her face, I was polite. But I did let Tank bark his head off at her heels as she walked back to her white Escalade. I started documenting everything after that: calls, notices, photos. Something in me knew this was just the beginning. The next week, one of their board members drove past slowly while I was cutting firewood and took photos of my outbuildings. I know what surveillance looks like, even when it's amateur hour. They always parked facing downhill so their plates couldn't be seen from my cameras. The worst part? My own neighbors started acting strange. The Simons stopped waving. Old Mrs. Dobbins wouldn't return my calls about the fence we shared. Someone even filed a complaint with the county claiming I was burning unauthorized materials. They sent out an inspector, who ended up apologizing for wasting my time after confirming I was just running a clean brush fire. It was all small stuff, petty. That's how these things work. They make you question your own sanity, chip away at your time and energy until you either move or conform. But they didn't know me. I don't bend easy, and I don't scare. The final straw came the morning I found a drone hovering over my barn. It wasn't a toy. It was a 2-0 quadcopter with thermal imaging and a mounted camera, hovering silently 20 feet off the ground. It followed me as I walked toward it, dipped when I raised my hand, then zipped back toward the tree line where someone in a blue HOA windbreaker was standing with a tablet. I didn't confront him. I didn't shoot it down. I just walked back inside calmly and pulled the case file I'd started months ago out of the cabinet. Then I opened a new tab on my laptop and started typing. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one. But I wasn't going to fight it on their terms. They wanted to play soldier. I was a soldier. And the difference between them and me? I never lost a fight I prepared for. The strange thing about escalation is how quietly it moves until suddenly you're chest deep in it. One week you're arguing with a woman in a salmon blazer about jurisdictional lines, the next you're dodging accusations that you're stockpiling weapons like some backwoods warlord. After the drone incident, I knew the HOA wouldn't back off, not after they'd invested so much energy into spinning me into some kind of boogeyman. But even I underestimated just how far Karen Mitchell and her clipboard mafia were willing to take things. It started with the flyers. One morning, I went out to grab my mail and noticed a stack of glossy trifold brochures, rubber banded to every mailbox on the gravel stretch of road that led to my property. Community Safety Alert, it read in bold red font. Below that, a photo, blurry, grainy, obviously taken from that same drone, of me in the yard with Tank at my side, hauling a few target dummies out of the back of my truck. The caption said, "Unpermitted militia training site discovered in expansion zone. Be advised, ongoing investigation." There was a QR code linking to the HOA's online newsletter, and beneath that, a bullet point list. Explosives suspected. Livestock used in tactical maneuvers. Nighttime gunfire reported. Non-compliance with neighborhood watch protocols. I stood in the road, turning the flyer over in my hands, and let out a single dry laugh. Tactical goats. That's what they'd landed on. The explosives were 2 expired propane tanks I'd set aside for disposal. The nighttime gunfire was a suppressed .22 I used to deal with the occasional coyote sniffing around my chicken coop. And the non-compliance, well, that part was true. I hadn't complied, not once, and I didn't plan to start now. But the phrase that stuck with me, the one that made the hairs on my arms rise, was ongoing investigation. That meant they were trying to loop in someone with a badge, or at least someone who carried themselves like they had one. The next week was a blur of strange encounters. I'd catch headlights creeping past my property at 3 a.m., pausing at the end of my long dirt driveway. Once, I heard the crunch of boots on gravel outside my barn just before dawn, but by the time I got outside with a flashlight and a sidearm, all I found was a cigarette butt still warm in the gravel and the faint smell of cologne that didn't belong to anyone in my zip code. I started noticing new tire tracks looping just off the easement that ran along my back fence, fresh footprints by the storm cellar. My game cameras started going missing, the cheap ones anyway. The good ones I'd hidden a little deeper. I replaced every single one, upgraded them, wired them to backup storage. I wasn't going to be the one caught flat-footed. Then came the visit from the county. A dusty white pickup with a magnetic decal reading zoning enforcement pulled into my driveway unannounced. The guy who got out was young, nervous, and looked like he'd been promised hazard pay. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, glancing around like he expected to be shot at. I nodded. "We received a complaint from your homeowners association about an unpermitted underground structure on the premises." I didn't even pretend to be surprised. "Storm cellar," I said flatly. "Built to code, existing structure when I bought the place. Want to see the original plans?" He blinked. Yeah, that would be great." I led him inside, showed him the folder, and poured him a cup of coffee while he skimmed. He left 20 minutes later with a full belly and a signed affidavit that the structure was legal, grandfathered in, and posed no hazard to public safety. But the fact that he'd been sent at all, that was the point. Karen and her crew weren't trying to find violations. They were trying to bury me in bureaucracy. 1 week after that, I found a notice taped to my gate from the State Wildlife Department. Unauthorized feeding of invasive species. Apparently, my goats, Noodle and Sergeant Spoons, had crossed the property line during a rainstorm and grazed on an ornamental shrub planted near the new model home 2 roads over. I walked the perimeter 3 times that afternoon, repairing fence posts that hadn't been damaged naturally. One of them had been cleanly sawed through halfway and then snapped by tension. Another had what looked like boot prints pressed into the dirt nearby, smaller than mine, but deliberate. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and laid out everything I'd gathered so far: maps, photos, copies of every notice, every accusation, every bogus inspection report. I even had screenshots from the neighborhood app where Karen had taken to posting ominous safety updates about unauthorized individuals conducting military-style training operations near the community greenbelt. I started digging into HOA records, which weren't public, but which I had ways of accessing, namely, my neighbor Sarah, who used to be on the board before she got pushed out over philosophical differences. She met me at the feed store one afternoon and handed me a flash drive tucked inside an empty box of dog biscuits. "Budget records, board minutes, vendor payments. You didn't get this from me." That night, I found something curious: repeated payments from the HOA account to a company called Shield Safe Solutions. The description said consultation services, private security. The payments weren't large, but they were monthly, recurring. I cross-checked the LLC and found it had been registered 3 months ago, right around the time I first started getting notices. The listed address? APO, Box 2 towns over. The registered agent? Mitchell, R., Karen's cousin. I couldn't make this stuff up. Then came the flashlights. One night, just before 1 a.m., I saw movement by the tree line, slow beams of light cutting through the mist, sweeping left to right, in rhythm. Not kids, not poachers. These were adults, moving in a methodical grid pattern. I killed the interior lights and watched from the second-story window, hand on my holstered Glock, phone already recording. 3 of them, dressed in matching gray windbreakers with reflective strips. One held a clipboard. One was scanning the barn with what looked like a thermal monocular. The third carried a 2-way radio. They never entered the property. They just stood at the edge, muttering and pointing at things. One of them reached into a backpack and started nailing something to my fence post. By the time I got down there, they were gone, vanished into the woods. The sign they left behind was metal, bolted into the wood with 4 screws. Red text on a white background. Warning, hostile zone, subject to raid. No HOA logo, no government seal, just pure intimidation, a bluff, but a calculated one. They were testing how far they could push, seeing if I'd flinch. I didn't. I took it down, photographed it, and stored it with the others. I also wired up a small surprise in the lower pasture, a remote-triggered floodlight rigged with a motion sensor and an old police siren, harmless, loud, and extremely discouraging to anyone trying to sneak through the fence again. I upgraded my locks, reinforced the barn doors. And, just for fun, I repositioned all my training dummies to make it look like I'd started hosting late-night drills with unknown personnel. If they wanted a ghost story, I'd give them one to whisper about. But I wasn't done. I printed 100 flyers of my own, no accusations, just a quote from the HOA bylaws about overreach, and a QR code linking to a website I'd built overnight, HOAtruth.net. The homepage featured every violation they'd levied against me, side by side with public records showing they were bogus. I distributed them on foot quietly in every mailbox I could reach. The next morning, half the neighborhood woke up thinking I was a threat. By evening, some of them weren't so sure. That's when I got the text from Sarah. No words, just a photo. Karen, standing in the parking lot of the Sunrise Valley Clubhouse, talking to a man in tactical pants and mirrored sunglasses, shaking hands over the hood of a matte black pickup truck. The man wore a patch on his sleeve, 3 Tactical Private Response Services. My eyes narrowed, I zoomed in, slapped the image into a facial recognition app. 2 hits, one was an ex-cop. The other? A guy who used to run weekend warrior boot camps for HOA neighborhood watch groups in Texas. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slow. This wasn't just Karen going off the rails. This was an operation, and if she thought I was going to roll over and play the villain in her homemade war game, she'd picked the wrong man. At 4:37 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, I woke to the distinct mechanical whine of drone rotors slicing the cold pre-dawn air. It wasn't the first time they'd flown one over my property, but this one sounded heavier, closer, and more deliberate. My bedside alarm read 4:37:16. I logged the time automatically, just like I had 100 times before on missions where timing could mean the difference between life and body bags. Tank was already growling by the back door, his hackles up and his ears pinned flat. He'd sensed it too, something different. I pulled on my jeans, slid into my boots, and reached behind the dresser for the small, weatherproof Pelican case I hadn't opened in months. Inside was a burner phone, a secondary radio, and a thumb drive preloaded with legal backups. I took all 3 and slipped them into my coat pocket. Outside, I could hear the crunch of gravel and the faint beep-beep-beep of a vehicle in reverse. I climbed up to the loft, pushed open the barn's side hatch, and peered out over my land through a pair of compact binoculars. That's when I saw them, 5 SUVs, all matte black with no plates, fanned out in a loose semicircle around my eastern gate. Behind them came a landscaping truck with a front-mounted battering ram that looked suspiciously like a reinforced log painted gray. 2 smaller ATVs zipped back and forth across the field, dragging what looked like mobile fencing on spools. Spotlights fired to life from the truck beds, washing the whole lower pasture in blinding white. The drone hovered above the barn roof, a big one this time, carrying a camera ball and what looked like a loudspeaker rig. I could hear it crackle on, followed by the warbled shriek of feedback, then Karen's voice, unmistakable and sharp as barbed wire. "Attention, property occupant. You are in violation of Sunrise Valley safety protocols. This area has been designated as non-compliant and subject to enforcement under HOA emergency bylaws. Step outside with your hands visible." She said it like she'd practiced, like she believed it. I almost laughed. They were trying to perform a neighborhood raid like it was a DEA bust. Except I used to work with the DEA, and what they'd just stepped into wasn't a suburban standoff, it was a sandbox I'd built myself, and they had no idea how out of their depth they were. I climbed down the loft ladder, took a slow breath, and walked over to the far wall of the barn. Mounted under a camouflaged panel was a breaker box I'd wired in myself, connected to a series of independent systems not tied to the main house power. I flipped 3 switches in sequence. 30 seconds later, a low hum filled the barn, followed by the pop of ignition capacitors in the floodlight system. At the far edge of the property, 4 mounted strobe towers, hidden in hollowed-out fence posts, burst to life and began strobing at 3.0 lumens per pulse. The effect was disorienting as hell, like a thunderstorm going off in your peripheral vision. The drone's spotlight blinked off, it lost its bearings and wobbled to the left. That's when I hit switch 4. From a small trapdoor on the side of the barn, a harmless smoke canister, the kind used in training ops and fire drills, hissed into life, filling the approach with a thick, chalky mist. The goats bleated once and retreated calmly into their enclosure. I'd trained them for months with a sound cue. 1 long whistle meant, "Quiet." They stayed silent. Down by the creek, I heard shouting. "We got smoke! "We got smoke," one of them yelled. Another, "Who's got eyes on the barn? I've lost thermal." I smiled. The thermal was never going to work. I'd lined the outside of the barn walls with scrap mylar and empty feed bags, poor man's insulation, but enough to scramble a hobby-grade thermal scope. They'd prepped for a YouTube militia. What they got was a retired Special Forces sergeant with too much time, too much land, and a grudge. I stepped out of the barn's back entrance, quiet, unseen, and circled around the west field toward the goat shed. That's where the real action was about to unfold. About 20 minutes earlier, I'd spotted a young guy with a shaved head crouched inside, remote controller in hand, eyes glued to a screen. Karen's drone pilot. He was focused, jittery, clearly not military. Probably someone's nephew who played too much Call of Duty. I crept up behind the shed and knocked twice on the wall. That was the cue. Inside, the shed lights burst on, blinding and disorienting. The goats, confused but cooperative, flooded forward into the central pen where I'd left a handful of feed. The kid shrieked, flailed, and dropped his controller into the hay. I opened the door, calmly stepped inside, and locked it behind me. "You all right there, son?" I asked. He looked at me like I was holding a grenade. I'm not armed," he stammered. "Good," I said, lifting his drop tablet and snapping a quick photo of the flight logs. "Then this won't take long." Outside, the yelling had reached a fever pitch. Karen's voice crackled through the speakers again, more frantic now. "Begin Phase 2. Secure the perimeter." But Phase 2 never started. Because by then, the Westfield strobe had cut out, fried by its own old wiring, and one of the enforcement volunteers had stumbled face first into a chicken wire trip line I'd strung across the access road. No injuries, just panic. And now they were scattered, confused, and off script. The battering ram truck revved up but never breached the gate. I'd welded a makeshift armor skirt to the inside posts 2 weeks earlier and reinforced them with 2 concrete-filled barrels. The truck hit it, bounced, and stalled out in a cloud of steam. I emerged from the goat shed with the drone pilot in tow, holding up his radio in one hand. "Karen," I said into it, "your operator's safe and uninjured. He just needs a ride home. Maybe let the kids sit out the next one, yeah?" There was a long pause, then a shriek of radio static, then silence. That's when the sheriff pulled up. Lights flashing, sirens silent. Sheriff Maddox wasn't new to this area. He'd been here before the HOA, before the model homes, back when this county still had gravel roads and handshake politics. He stepped out of his cruiser, squinting at the floodlights, and took in the scene. 5 vehicles, 1 wrecked gate, a scattered mob of wannabe commandos in matching surplus vests. A smoke-hazed barnyard, and me, standing calmly in the center with my coat zipped, hands empty, drone tablet in one hand and the other on the kid's shoulder like a camp counselor. "Morning, Sheriff," I called out. "Little early for all this, isn't it?" He walked up, slowly, one brow raised. "What the hell's going on here, Jack?" I handed him the tablet. Drone surveillance, unauthorized entry, property damage, false reports, that there's the drone flight log. That there, I pointed to the SUV where Karen was now standing, red-faced and screaming into her phone, is your probable cause. Maddox looked down at the tablet, then back at me. "And you didn't hurt anybody?" "Wouldn't dream of it," I said. "This was all de-escalation." Karen stormed up. "Sheriff, arrest him! He took one of our contractors hostage and assaulted my staff." Maddox didn't flinch. "I've got a half dozen 911 calls from neighbors about a possible paramilitary incursion," he said dryly. "You want to explain what the hell Operation Front Lawn is?" Karen froze. "Excuse me?" "You said it, on tape. This man," he jerked a thumb toward me, "sent me audio of you yelling that phrase over a loudspeaker while your people rolled up in unmarked vehicles and started issuing commands like this was Fallujah." I pulled the USB from my pocket. "Backup copy," I said, handing it over. "And for the record, Sheriff, I've got legal title to this land, a registered firearm range, and documents proving I'm not under HOA jurisdiction." Karen's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He's dangerous. He's building bunkers. He has tactics." Maddox raised a hand. "Karen, stop talking." Around us, the HOA stormtroopers had begun quietly peeling off their gear, stuffing vests into car trunks, and pretending they hadn't just tried to reenact Red Dawn on a goat farm. I watched them disperse, one by one, like a birthday party no one wanted to admit went sideways. Maddox turned back to me. "You pressing charges?" "Not yet," I said. "But I'd like to make a formal complaint, and I'd like you to collect witness statements from the neighbors who recorded all this on their phones." He nodded. "Already happening. I'll send you the incident report by tomorrow." Karen stood frozen, her face an unreadable mix of rage and panic. "You'll hear from our legal team," she hissed. "I sincerely hope I do," I said, smiling faintly. "I'd love to explain to a judge how your HOA declared a tactical operation on a retired Special Forces operator because his goats chewed through your fiber optics." Tank barked once from the porch. I didn't call him off. Let the moment hang. Let the world know this wasn't over. Not yet, but it damn sure wasn't going their way anymore. They thought the raid was the end of it, that once the flashlights cooled, the SUVs disappeared, and the drone was packed up in its case, the mess would fade into some neighborhood whisper, a one-time overstep in the name of community safety. But that's the thing about people who play at power. They never think long enough about what happens when they lose control of the story. By noon that Tuesday, the story had legs. By sunset, it had wings. Sheriff Maddox did exactly what he said he would, filed the incident report, gathered statements, and quietly started making calls. And me? I'd already made mine. That thumb drive I gave him? There were 10 copies. One went to the state attorney's office, one to the county commissioner, one, the juicy one, to Channel 4 News in Waco, along with a polite email titled, "Paramilitary Raid Carried Out by Suburban HOA, Video Attached." I didn't even have to write a headline. They took care of that. Barricade at Briar Creek. Suburban HOA declares war on veteran homeowner, flashed across screens by that evening. It had everything the media loved: conflict, crazy people with money, tactical cosplay, and a quiet ex-soldier who looked like he just wanted to be left alone. That last part? That's how I won the court of public opinion before the real legal war even started. Karen Mitchell, self-declared HOA president, suddenly found herself facing more than just angry neighbors. The footage of her yelling, "Operation Front Lawn is a go," clipped down to a 4-second soundbite, went viral on local Reddit, and made its way into a few national Facebook mom groups, which is the social media equivalent of unleashing a biblical plague. And the internet did what the internet does best. It started digging. Turns out, Shield Safe Solutions, the private security contractor Karen used to justify her stormtrooper stunt, wasn't just run by her cousin Randall Mitchell. It was Randall, one guy, registered to a P.O. box and a burner phone, with a website that looked like it had been built in 2007 by someone who just discovered Photoshop filters. There were no certifications, no insurance, and certainly no authority to coordinate operations under the guise of public enforcement. Worse, the payments. Oh, the payments. Buried deep in HOA meeting minutes were monthly disbursements to Shield Safe for risk analysis and security planning. I had the receipts. $5,000 a month for over a year. Not only was Randall billing the HOA, but he'd also submitted invoices for drone fleet maintenance, tactical gear acquisition, and emergency incursion readiness. That battering ram? Coded as landscaping equipment. The drones? Aerial wildlife surveying tools. The HOA dues, inflated just months prior with a line about increased patrol costs, had been funding a personal war fantasy. And Karen had signed every check. When the residents of Sunrise Valley caught wind of it, the neighborhood imploded faster than a power grid during a Texas ice storm. Homeowners who'd paid $600 a month to have their trash bins measured and porch lights cited for being too amber suddenly realized they were footing the bill for tactical cosplay and illegal surveillance. At first, Karen tried to do damage control. She hosted a Zoom meeting, told the community that the situation had spiraled beyond her intent, claimed I'd brandished weapons, and refused de-escalation efforts. But then came my turn. Because you see, I'd installed cameras of my own, hidden, redundant, wired directly into cloud backups with time-stamped overlays and a polite little title card that read, "Footage from 4:37 a.m. Subject, unauthorized entry. I sent the full, unedited version to the local precinct. But I also posted a subtitled highlight reel online, stitched together with some light banjo music and a timestamp overlay every time someone in her fake enforcement unit tripped over my tripwire or got scared by a goat. It wasn't just funny, it was damning. One clip in particular sealed the deal: Karen holding the loudspeaker yelling, "Take the barn if he resists," while Randall, fully geared up in what appeared to be borrowed SWAT cosplay, dramatically nodded like he was about to breach Fallujah. That clip got 500,000 views in 2 days. It also got Karen disinvited from the HOA gala, and then from the HOA altogether, because 2 days after the raid, the board called an emergency session not to support her, but to distance themselves. Turns out, not everyone was in on the plot. Board members who'd previously voted in lockstep began recalling their approvals. We didn't understand the full scope of Karen's initiative. I thought we were just installing new signage. I had no idea there were drones. The ones who had known? Gone. One resigned mid-meeting. Another, Margaret Ellis, the treasurer, retired for personal reasons after her name surfaced on 3 separate payments to Shield Safe LLC. I didn't have to lift a finger. The community was eating itself alive. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I let the evidence speak. When the county inspector came around to evaluate structural compliance, I walked him through every inch of my property, showed him permits, survey lines, firearm registration logs, even my compost plan. He left with a handshake and a subtle nod that said, "They messed with the wrong guy." By the end of the week, the HOA was under official investigation. The county ordered a freeze on discretionary spending until an audit could be completed. Randall was issued a cease and desist for impersonating law enforcement. And Karen? She went underground. No, really. Rumor had it she left town to stay with her sister in Oklahoma. Her house, once the HOA's model home, sat dark for a week before a for sale by owner sign appeared at the curb, though no one in the neighborhood would say they'd seen her pack. Just like that, the self-appointed general of the HOA militia vanished. Her name scraped from the HOA website. Her Instagram turned private. All that was left was a bad Wikipedia entry someone made titled, "Oh Karen, the Briar Creek Incident." Because while Karen was digging her own grave with a megaphone, I was laying bricks. I'd filed for injunctive relief 2 days after the raid. And with all the video, paperwork, and community support, it passed without resistance. A county judge ruled that the Sunrise Valley HOA had acted far beyond its scope of authority and dissolved its ability to enforce outside the original development zone. My property? Officially and permanently declared exempt. What's more, the judge mandated the HOA refund every homeowner whose dues had been illegally inflated to fund security operations. That's nearly 200. Zero returned to families who thought they were paying for new benches and pool filters, not tactical LARPing in the backwoods. The entire board, even the cowards who claimed ignorance, were forced to resign under community pressure. In a special election held in the community center 2 weeks later, the new board voted to suspend all punitive enforcement and reassess every HOA policy, starting from scratch. People started coming to me for help, for advice, for strategy. I didn't want to run for board president. I didn't want a seat at the table. I just wanted peace. And when the last of the fake fences was pulled from my property and the damaged gate was repaired, I did one thing. I carved a wooden sign from a slab of cedar, sanded it smooth, and burned the words in with a soldering iron. Peace was never given. It was earned. Then I mounted it to the top of my fence, right next to the newly installed camera pole and a respectfully trimmed American flag. Tank sat beside me as I hammered in the final nail. The goats grazed quietly in the field behind us, and the air, for the first time in a year, felt still, peaceful, mine.